Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the mechanics of systemic institutional decline through a fascinating, albeit incredibly dark, case study. We're drawing directly from a narrative called The Societal Rot, which is essentially a blueprint for understanding how massive corporate and institutional structures slowly decay from the inside out. And to be clear, we aren't looking at some comic book villainy here. We are looking at the mundane, everyday machinery of compromise.
Okay, right off the bat, let's dive into this incredibly jarring realization from our protagonist, James Whitmore. James is a middle manager who spends 17 years at a firm called Mercer & Associates, and what he discovers is that institutional rot isn't driven by supervillains plotting in smoky boardrooms. Instead, it's driven by completely normalized daily compromises. It's that terrifying realization that the people running the machine are just ordinary folks optimizing for their own survival within the constraints they've been given.
So that brings us to the core of our explainer today. We're going to follow James's psychological and professional descent to understand exactly how the corporate machinery traps completely rational actors into perpetuating self-destructive systems. How do you go from a bright-eyed 24-year-old who genuinely believes in creating value to a guy who actively orchestrates the destruction of thousands of livelihoods? Well, let's find out. Section 1. The machinery of compromise. All right, let's start with the daily grind. The erosion of morality doesn't usually happen with some massive, dramatic explosion. It starts with incredibly small, seemingly harmless semantic gymnastics at our desks every single day. Just take a peek into what we might call the dictionary of deception. When James's boss, Vincent, asks him to contextualize a shortfall, he's structurally mandating complicity. Vincent isn't asking James to fix a failure, right? He's asking him to dress up institutional collapse in the vocabulary of hope. They'll use words like trajectory to discuss a direction without actually committing to what that direction even is. The contrast here between the actual bleeding numbers and the beautiful lie James crafts to keep the board happy is just wild. The enterprise segment is totally hemorrhaging, down 31%. But the narrative James creates transforms that terrifying reality into a quote-unquote temporary anomaly in a long pattern of growth. He literally takes the truth and pressure cooks it until it turns into a completely different substance. And man, watch how this builds over time. As James moves up the corporate ladder chronologically, his moral compass and his personal life simultaneously plummet. Year by year, his title gets grander, his salary swells, and yet his marriage turns into a hollow shell of roommates just passing in the kitchen. The system promotes him specifically because he is willing to accept higher and higher levels of cognitive dissonance. He's effectively trading his actual family time for the comfort of institutional acceptance. Section 2. The architecture of deception. So, having accepted his initial promotion, James is moved to strategic operations, which is a department essentially dedicated to managing the narrative of the organization's decline. It's here that the real work of institutional dishonesty takes place at a macro level. When assessing existential threats like climate change or terrible labor conditions in developing markets, the system only calculates the risk to profits. It entirely ignores the human cost. When James's team evaluates these threats, material risk doesn't mean sea levels rising or people suffering. It strictly means the risk of a lawsuit or a bad PR cycle that might temporarily hurt the stock price. Taking a step back, the macro-level rule of this ecosystem is actually pretty simple. You cannot be ethical in isolation because the market will punish you. Fixing unethical labor practices would cost up to 10% of their operating budget. But if there's only a 30% chance of a PR nightmare, well, the rational corporate math says complicity is the better deal. To be the only ethical company is to accept lower margins, which means the market destroys you. So everyone just agrees together. I'll just let that incredibly cynical wisdom from James's boss sink in for a second. This highlights the absolute sociopathy required to keep the machine running. They aren't in the business of selling products or improving lives anymore. They are entirely in the business of manufacturing a narrative that the market will then reward with capital. Section 3. Engineering the collapse. Eventually, the company's actual growth hits a brick wall. The traditional markets are completely saturated, so requiring an entirely new, fictional narrative to keep the stock price artificially inflated, James and his team engineer a complete illusion of digital transformation. And this inexplicably generates $4 billion in market value out of thin air. They don't actually transform the company, mind you. They just announce that they are transitioning to a new digital-first growth model. The market hears opportunity instead of decline, and the stock price spikes, creating $4 billion based on nothing but semantics and some really well-designed pitch decks. But you can only pretend to transform for so long, right? When the fake growth narrative inevitably runs out of runway, the executives need an exit strategy. This leads us to ask a pretty morbid question. How exactly is value extracted from a corporate corpse? How do the people at the very top get rich when the underlying business is actually failing? Let's break down the private equity playbook, looking at the cold, calculated steps used to enrich the board while passing the fatal debt right back onto the company itself. First, you signal a buyout, netting the current board a massive premium on their shares. Then, the new owners load the dying company with debt to pay for the purchase. To service that massive new debt, they slash the workforce. Finally, they try to flip it again or just let it go bankrupt. The executives win, the private equity firm wins, and the institution itself takes the lethal blow. Section 4. The Mathematics of Ruin. So the take-private transaction succeeds and the narrative phase ends. Now the financial extraction phase begins, and we have to examine the brutal, devastating logic of this restructuring. This staggering number represents the immediate human cost. 4,000 people, roughly 32% of the entire workforce, are given 15 minutes to pack their desks and leave the building, all so a financial spreadsheet can balance. People who had dedicated decades of their lives to this organization are erased in a single afternoon, simply to ensure the new debt obligations can be met. Now here's where it all falls apart. While the ruthless cuts achieved the desired cost savings, they completely destroyed the company's ability to actually serve its customers. They projected a minor drop in revenue, but in reality, it plummeted by $300 million. Why? Because you absolutely cannot manipulate your way out of structural decline. Cutting the workforce destroyed institutional knowledge, customer trust, and operational capacity. The spreadsheet balanced? Sure, but the actual company died. As the original company is dismantled and sold for parts, James moves on to a shiny, highly lucrative new consulting firm, Mercer & Kellerman. Here, he uses his so-called strategic alignment skills to perpetrate this exact same cycle of extraction onto other struggling companies. He is no longer just a participant in the machine, he is now a master architect of it. In a deeply haunting moment of legal testimony years later, James is forced to admit a terrifying truth under oath. He deliberately designed a restructuring for a client that intentionally underfunded employee pensions to prioritize debt reduction and shareholder returns. This conscious design choice cost 8,000 employees an average of $140,000 each in lost retirement security. It wasn't an accident. It was the math functioning exactly as intended. And finally, Section 5, the inescapable system. Despite realizing the massive concrete destruction he has caused, and having lost his wife and family connection in the process, James stays in his lucrative position. Why does he stay? Well, because the system doesn't require active enforcement. It simply makes the personal cost of resistance so incredibly high that everyone voluntarily surrenders. If you speak out, you lose your house, your kids' tuition, and your entire identity. Since the system prevents industry-wide coordination, individual heroism is basically just self-sabotage. So the most logical, rational choice an individual can make is to just play along. Until, eventually, you aren't just playing along anymore. You are the machine. James didn't navigate the corporate world as he once thought. The corporate world slowly navigated and consumed him until there was nothing left but his title and his bank account. Each tiny compromise, each contextualized report, each ignored risk was just a breadcrumb, leading him deeper into the dark woods of complicity, until turning back was completely impossible. Based on the compromises we all normalize every single day, the emails you gloss over, the numbers you subtly shift, the ethical gray areas you justify for the sake of a paycheck, we have to leave you with one final terrifying question about your own complicity in the systems you inhabit. Are you navigating the system, or is the system navigating you? Definitely something to chew on the next time you sit down at your desk. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer.